Welcome, listeners, to this episode of The Abstract. My name is Tyler Finn. I lead community for SpotDraft, and I am really excited to be sitting today with Genessa Stout, the COO and General Counsel of Tally. Tally's B2B to C fintech company that helps people pay their credit card debt, backed by investors like Andreessen Horowitz and Kleiner Perkins. Since Tally launched, they've helped consumers pay off more than $1 billion in credit card debt, which is a pretty cool track record. Genessa, you'll hear a little bit more about your background today, but welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Tyler. I'm really happy to be here.
You've had a really interesting career from litigation, now COO, working in government. We're going to get to all that. But before we examine that trajectory, I'd really love to hear about some of your early innings and what drove you to law school and made you decide to pursue a career as a lawyer.
Yeah. Thanks, Tyler. Well, for me, my career has certainly been much more of a winding path than any sort of straight line. I definitely didn't think that this is where I would be, although I'm very happy to be here. And law school, becoming a lawyer, it wasn't really ever a long-term goal for me. I grew up on a farm in like a really rural part of Washington state. I didn't even really know about lawyers, like that was a thing, let alone, know any actual lawyers. So I didn't really have a sense for what a legal career would even look like. But I've really always liked learning, and my curiosity really is what's propelled me through college and onward. And I knew I wanted to go to grad school, and it was really around sort of the end of my time in undergrad that I started thinking about what would I maybe want to do next. And I started considering law school because I found the intellectual pursuit of the law interesting. I liked politics. I thought that was interesting. So I thought it was compelling, but I didn't have this like big overarching dream of like wanting to be a lawyer. That just wasn't something that was in my periphery, really.
Now, I know that out of law school, you ended up doing plaintiff-side class action work.
Mhm.
It's pretty common to maybe transition from something like that to an in-house role right away. And you ended up going to the Consumer Financial Protection
Yeah.
Bureau. Curious about sort of like both of those positions and the interplay between the two. And I think that sort of moment in history as well, which was pretty interesting around American politics and what was happening with the CFPB.
Yeah, totally. Well, on to the first point, I guess I could also say, as I just mentioned, I didn't really know what I wanted to do even before law school. But just I decided when I was finishing my undergrad, I was like, I think I could like being a lawyer, but why don't I get a job at a law firm to just be
Mhm.
around lawyers and see if I would even like it. And so I did that. I got a job at a law firm, and the law firm was actually Hagens Berman, Sobel Shapiro. I was the receptionist there.
Oh,
So
wow.
yeah.
On
So
both
I
sides of law school.
yeah, I actually started there as a receptionist. I worked there all through law school. I would help in accounting eventually. Sometimes I ended up doing paralegal type work. And then I eventually worked there as a lawyer after law school as well. And so I kind of just stumbled into it by just starting out my legal career at Hagens Berman. But part of the reason I thought I would like law school is because I liked the work that at
Mhm.
Hagens Berman, even from a non-legal perspective. There's a different pace to plaintiff side complex litigation. I liked the challenge of like unraveling facts and like building a case. You're more in a first mover position. You're like initiating the case as opposed to defense work. You're reacting and you're playing catch a lot. So that served me really well when I went to the CFPB. But to your point, if I could just have one like little side rant on what helped me like be really interested in the CFPB is
Mhm.
I got out of law school right around the time of the financial crisis. And a lot of the work that Hagens Berman ended up doing at that time was related to consumer financial issues. People lost their houses, or it was just a whole slew of consumer financial concerns. And I had this uh, partner that said, okay, go figure out what regulatory decisions have ever come down on these sorts of consumer financial issues. And I went off to do my research project, and I could find two decisions since like the 70s. And
Really?
yeah, there was just There was the Office of Thrift Supervision had one, and there just was nothing, and I don't think I'm the most insightful person about politics, but even for me, I was like, "Wow, this seems like a really big gap." And then when I saw that the CFPB was being formed when Elizabeth Warren, like, put forward this idea, for me,
Mhm.
it really resonated. And so the experience I'd had at Hagens Berman really helped me be very interested in what the CFPB was gonna do. And really the work in enforcement in CFPB is also kind of in that first mover position where you're building a case, putting it together, and I really enjoyed that. So
Tell us a little bit about that time at the CFPB. I'm curious, what were you working on? It was pretty early innings for the agency, right?
yeah, I mean, in the beginning, we didn't have authority from Congress. So in the beginning, it was a lot of hypothetical, like planning, like what, how would we do things? How will we subpoena for documents? Where does that authority come from? I mean, sort of the very basic building blocks of what that should look like,
Mhm.
which was really interesting because you normally don't, usually when you enter into government process, it's like existed for years and years and years. And this was a lot of very foundational work of putting that in place. And then that sort of trend continued, everything was like, "This is the first time we've ever done blah, blah, blah," and that was really kind of fun. It was fun to be in a group of people, like, learning together and understanding how to do this. We certainly, made lots of mistakes and learned a lot, but it was a really exciting time to be part of that, and, certainly I knew that there was really a need to have protection for consumers in that place, and so it was really exciting to work on.
I'm sure it was also probably tough at times. I mean, it's a very political environment. I'm curious, throughout those years, what kept you motivated and kept you going?
Yeah, well, as I just sort of alluded to, one of the valuable things that happened to me during my time at Hagens Berman, I mean, most plaintiffs firms don't usually hire somebody right out of law school. It's just there's not the infrastructure to train you. And so it's a lot more, I guess, loose maybe than a big law firm that has a lot of infrastructure. So
Mhm.
I think it's important to keep that in mind as you're somebody getting right out of law school. But for me, a lot of what I did is they threw me in and said, okay, start talking to these consumers and understand like what their issues are and their concerns are as a input to building cases. And so for me, that really has been a motivator of just understanding how, the financial issues that we all face, these are like really core issues to our lives and impacts our happiness in our life, our mental
Of
health,
course.
just overall security. And so I think this, even today, to my role at Tally, where we're really focused on helping people with credit card debt, which is also, I think, a really big aspect of American consumers' financial life, that has really motivated me because I think it's an important place to make sure we're thinking about what we can do to support consumers in the US.
From the CFPB, you then ended up deciding to go in-house and tried your hand working for PayPal. How'd you know it was time, I guess? I mean, I can imagine
Yeah.
being at the CFPB and feeling like you're really making a difference and feeling really motivated. How did you know it was time maybe for you personally and professionally to move to PayPal?
Yeah, I had a humbling moment, Tyler. I think, and I say this with, I think, an appropriate amount, I hope anyways, of like a little bit of embarrassment or I when I finished law school and then Hagens Berman and even at the CFPB as well, I think I was pretty strident and probably a little bit arrogant in my views. I thought, corporations are the real problem, and they're always going to like screw over the little guy. And a big lesson I will just say I've learned throughout my legal career is a problem can look so different from a different point of view, and it's just really valuable to be
Mhm.
curious and examine problems through different lenses. So I had this, very like outsized sort of maybe like self-aggrandizing a little bit view of like we have to like make these things right, to help consumers. And I do believe there's threads of truth in there. Our
Mhm.
capitalism does tend to capitalize on weaker people, and those people deserve protections. But I had this moment, and this is sort of the humbling part, is I worked really, really hard on all my cases at the CFPB and at Hagens Berman, and I really tried to drive the best outcomes possible for consumers. I wanted to do what I could to try to help shape a better marketplace. And in every instance, I had this moment at the CFPB, and I was sitting there realizing like just how hard I've worked over the last few years on this one particular case. And I realized what would actually be better is if this whole thing had never happened. If at the beginning, like, we just had never the behavior that caused the
Mhm.
underlying behavior, if that just hadn't happened and consumers didn't have to go through all of this. And the only way you can, like, really change the way a consumer is treated up front is within the company, right, that's offering the consumer the product. And having when I had that realization, it really shifted things for me of, like, there are a lot of ways to advocate and support and help consumers, not just one. And I guess that's the
Mhm.
humbling part is I just see how narrow my thinking was originally. So that is what really led me to PayPal is I decided, "Okay, I wanna try to work on these problems from a different perspective." And PayPal really helped me understand the complexities of building and delivering these types of products at scale. So it was a really great experience.
Tell us a little bit, I mean, to what you can, about some of the issues that you worked on at PayPal, because then I'm really curious for how you made the transition from that sort of work into, a really general role as your first GC role at Tally. But we'll get to Tally in a sec.
Okay, yeah, at PayPal, one thing that happened that I mean, PayPal has a lot of really great consumer products, including Venmo. And
Mhm.
so one of the things I spent a lot of time working on was Venmo. And as we know at startups, things just sometimes grow so quickly and so fast that
Yeah.
there's not any ill intention. It's just like things get ahead of you. And so there was a lot of really interesting work to do I mean, Venmo is such a great product, like, it makes life so much better and easier, but there was a lot of work I was able to come in and do at Venmo of really just helping to catch up and put some of the processes in place that, just in a really high growth startup sometimes can get missed. So that was really interesting, and it was really illuminating for me in what a challenge it is, and you can have the very best of intentions within a company, and then you're like, "We're doing what?" I didn't realize that that's what's happening. And PayPal as well. I mean, the consumer products at PayPal, I think, are also something that can be really enable a consumer's life and enable, like, online transactions.
I use Venmo almost every weekend, so,
Really?
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
I'm sure that was an exciting time for Venmo as well, as it was really taking off and growing, and there was the whole social aspect to it too.
Yeah, totally. And there was, like, the privacy laws and things they've evolved so much if you think back to, like,
Sure.
2011, 2012. I mean, it was
Uh-huh.
very different, and so Venmo was kind of in the midst of all of that, and it's hard sometimes when you're in the midst of a really fast changing regulatory environment to figure out how to give good advice as a lawyer
Mhm.
inside. So, yeah, but so that was a really exciting opportunity and time.
But sometimes, as you're highlighting, you definitely need a lawyer in the room,
Yeah.
or someone who's
Yes.
thinking deeply about the consumer protection issues as much as the sort of growth and how to deliver a great product to consumers.
Yes. Yeah, that's right.
Then you made the move to Tally, and,
Mhm.
I think you've had a pretty exciting run there. Now you end up you serve as COO and
Mhm.
sales, marketing, finance.
I think it was kind of a combination. It was just I met somebody that worked there at an event, as one does around Silicon Valley.
Yeah.
So, it was just a connection like that where we started talking and then it eventually evolved into that. But it took a little while because I think for at least for me as a lawyer, the thought of being not only the only lawyer in a company, but the first lawyer
Mhm.
felt really, really, really terrifying. And that so it took me a while to adjust to that idea, to be okay with it. Now I realize it's just like anything else. You just figure out one problem and then you figure out the next problem and just like that's sort of what we do as lawyers, right? We just figure out one problem after another and it's not as overwhelming as it seems. When you think about the whole thing, it feels overwhelming, but when you think
Mhm.
about like okay, now I'm working on this. Okay, I do know the answer to this. And then we can think about the next problem. But it took me a little while to get confident in that. Tally had started out, it's a lending company. So we lend money or we lend lines of credit to consumers with credit card debt. And basically, this helps them save money on interest because we give them a lower APR and help them
Sure.
pay off their cards more efficiently. So that requires lending licenses. And so that was a big start. And because I'd had a lot of exposure to just regulatory frameworks, that was a good starting place for me in terms of just getting my feet under me. And then eventually I started evolving into, more even just legal issues. You kind of are like, okay, let
Mhm.
me figure out how this trademark thing works. Now let me figure out this other. And so it just kind of evolved over time.
And you began to take on other business responsibilities as well. Tell us a little bit about how you leveraged that sort of legal expertise or your role within the company to begin to grow in new areas.
Yeah, I would say, and this is just unique to me. I mean, I think it could be totally understandable that somebody could really have their heart set on being COO, and that could be the goal they were heading for.
Hmm.
That wasn't the case for me. This kind of has evolved, but really the next thing after GC is I started taking on a lot of the people responsibilities, which is a pretty
Hmm.
natural segue for a lot of lawyers. There's a lot of employment issues that are overlapping, especially when COVID started. I really started taking on more of those issues. And as I start figuring out more of these problems, it just continued to kind of grow to say, okay, I think I can understand this and can
Hmm.
help us figure out how to navigate through this as well.
And tell us a little bit about the progression of functions reporting into you, I guess. And one of the things that I'm really curious there to dig in on is how you built trust with either the, existing team members or the executives who, now were reporting up into you.
Yep. Okay, so I'll answer that part first. I think part of the way you build trust is like it's so working at a startup is hard. I mean, work is hard in general, but I
Yeah.
think working at a startup can be extra hard because it's just there's not a lot of infrastructure, and so you're like, okay, we got to figure this compensation. How are we going to do that? Like from zero, as opposed to
Hmm.
coming in where there's sort of a framework. Just as one example. So I think one way to build trust is people just need help. And if you're willing to get in there and be a real partner with them, even if it isn't totally a pure legal issue, but I think lawyers, the way we are trained to think and analyze problems, we have a lot of skills at just coming in and being a thought partner and a support and helping people navigate forward. And I think that's a great way to build trust. You might not have the answer, but you can help figure out an answer or help figure
Hmm.
out the considerations for the answer. So that would be the most practical thing I could say is be willing to get in there and get your hands dirty with other people and really be a partner to them. And I think that builds a lot of trust as well. To the first part of your question about the progression, it really is sort of as the business evolved. So in some cases, it would be there, the situation might be we need someone to really step in and help lead the people function. It may be we're transitioning the way finance is being led and there's a
Hmm.
gap. Genessa could probably do it, so sometimes it's a little bit more just of what's happening in the moment, and it's just kind of progressively continued it that way, and then Jason Brown, the CEO of Tally, as he and I started working more and more closely together, then we started thinking about, okay, what actually makes sense in the way we structure Tally's leadership team? How can we make this team the most effective, strongest team possible? And then eventually that's how it ended up that the functions are reporting into me.
You talked a little bit about HR, where I think you're right. I think there is often a natural sort of overlap
Mhm.
in the skill set or even a lot of the employment law issues that might have been shared between legal and a head of people. And so I think it's increasingly common now to see, unless there's a dedicated sort of chief people officer focused on culture, it's common to see someone who runs both legal and HR. Some of the
Mhm.
other functions, though, and we don't have to talk about all of them, take your pick, but whether it's finance or product and engineering or recruiting, there may not be as natural of an overlap between the sort of skills of the
Mhm.
GC and the subject matter expertise in those functions. Tell us about the sort of learning curve. Did you pursue formal education in any of these areas?
Yeah. I have this to show you. This is my Accounting for Dummies right here.
That's
This is a
amazing.
people book I read. But to be clear, I mean, I'm not running a no one will ever be hiring me to run accounting for anything. And really, the real thing is to hire somebody who's awesome at this function and figure out how to support them. Yes, though, there is a learning curve. I was very intimidated to start leading finance, and I feel more like I support finance. We have a really great team in place at Tally now that I feel super proud of, and the part I can be proud of is that they're so awesome. Not
Mhm.
that, that I'm an expert in finance, but yes, I think part of being able to hire someone who's great and then support that person is you do need to have some sort of understanding, and that could come from reading. This people book I read is this Jack Altman People Strategy, as just a way to start. And I listed as a podcast,
Uh-huh.
some, kind of along these lines, reading articles, just anything to start getting yourself educated. Talking to people that are actually in the space also has been really helpful for me. One, we also have a credit team at Tally, and that's my current area that I'm really trying to learn more. And I'm never going to be an expert at credit, but as I'm learning more about it, I think I can learn more about how to support people in that function so that the people that are the real experts can do their best work.
I'm sure our listeners are curious. Besides, of course, the abstract, what are some other podcasts that you've been listening to recently?
Oh, well, I mean, I have so many. Some I don't know if I want to say publicly because they're a little bit embarrassing.
You
Okay,
don't need to share the guilty pleasures, but,
yeah. Yeah, well, I love all the, like, probably regular news ones. I mean, the daily I love Pivot, that's a great one. Kara Swisher and Scott Galloway, they're
Mhm.
great. Can I tell you, you may choose to take this out of the podcast, which is fine, but I just listened to this great podcast that I can't stop thinking about, and it's called Pressure Cooker, and it's it a Canadian broadcasting company put it out, and it's about these 2 individuals in Vancouver, Canada, that basically were part of a sting operation against them. They had converted to Islam and had loosely talked about some sort of act of terrorism, but they
Mhm.
were quite vulnerable, drug addictions, maybe mentally not the highest IQs, and the Canadian police pulled off this massive sting operation, undercover sting operation against them. And it's a
Mhm.
really fascinating story about their sort of journey with the Canadian police. I really enjoyed the whole thing. So I think I really enjoyed like journalistic podcasts like that as well that are just great stories and great insights into culture. So Pressure Cooker, I would really it
I
was
will
both.
add that to
Yeah.
my
Yeah,
list.
listen, I think you'll enjoy it, so.
I'm lucky to spend a lot of time on planes visiting customers and future podcast guests all around the
Yeah.
country, and so I'll listen to that one,
Okay,
as
do.
fall travel kicks off.
Okay, awesome. It was quite fascinating.
As you've grown into the COO role, I see, probability that you're a lot more responsible for sort of culture across the organization than you once were, and setting that tone in a quasi virtual or remote environment. Tell us a little bit about what you think works well for setting and building culture.
Sure. One thing I have learned is that culture is what it is today, and you can't count on that it's gonna be that for 6 months. It's something you have to always be investing in, always be sensitive to it, always be realizing that it's growing and changing and evolving. So just because your culture was one way 6 months ago doesn't mean that that's what it is today. And so that has been a really valuable lesson for me to not take any of that for granted. Another thing is, and this is not novel, but culture really is modeled at the top, right? So the
Mhm.
behaviors of the leaders are really going to inform the culture. And that's not just the CEO or COO. It is those people, but it's also the people leading the teams. And I think it continues to trickle down. I had a situation a few weeks ago where somebody was giving me some feedback on something that they thought I could have done better on. And
Mhm.
it can feel really hard, especially when you work really hard on this and you tried to do a really good job and they're telling you that wasn't good. That can be hard. And how do you respond in that moment? I
Mhm.
think that really informs the culture a lot. And then, culture is really it's the aggregate behaviors of the group of people.
Mhm.
And so I think just being really sensitive to that and talking about that as a group. One thing we do at Tally is we try during our town halls, we try to have somebody give a values presentation where it talks about one of Talia's three different values and talking about one of the values. And it can be really whatever they want. Like, this is a way they've seen the value model, this is what it means to them. But just having things built into your culture where you repeatedly reinforce the behaviors that you want to model as part of your culture.
I love that. You have a boss or a CEO who never takes a vacation or doesn't
Yeah.
take maternity or paternity leave themselves,
Yep.
or right, responds to messages immediately at 1 in the morning, right? It's going to set a very different tone for the organization than maybe someone who models slightly different behavior. So I love that you think about sort of modeling behavior both yourself, but also how you can highlight examples of other folks modeling it as well.
Yeah, very much so. And sometimes you need people to tell you these things even when it's hard to hear. I mean, my team told me it really stresses us out when you Slack us at 10 PM. And I was thinking like, well, this is where I'm catching up on everything. And it actually helps me feel less stressed to be, getting these things off my plate. But them explaining that to me and me being willing to receive that has helped me, let me change my behavior and not slack somebody at 10 PM and just recognize I want to be respectful of their time. But I think these are just all small things. There's not like one magical thing, but it is really all of the behaviors put together that make up the culture.
As you think about the sort of, I guess, year and a half so far that you've been in the bigger role, and look back on your time as a solely sort of a legal leader, what advice would you have for folks who might be a GC, but I guess they might also, just be working as a lawyer in a firm and want to expand their scope or grow
Mhm.
into a broader business leadership role over time?
Yeah, one thing I would really encourage people that are interested in that path is to really understand the business from many different points of view
Mhm.
and understand what does this group care about? What does this group care about? And try to understand the whole machine that fits together of the business because that gives you such better insight into the way the company works. And this it's true of lawyers as we know. If you're the lawyer that comes in and is like, "No, that won't work." That's not very helpful, right? The goal is to like try to figure out a path forward. And I don't think that only applies to lawyers. I think that's true in any function is like, okay, what is Tally as a company or whatever your company is, what do we need to do? Like, what are the objectives of the business? And so, what can we do in service of that? So, I think the first thing is if you want to expand your scope, you can't just stay in your lane and like be like,
Mhm.
I'm the lawyer, this is what I do. You do the other things. You have to be willing to branch out in a way that's not too annoying to everybody else.
Mhm.
And then I think another thing is be willing to own hard, complicated things that nobody else wants to do because they're hard and complicated. And, I mean, it's just like, it's a lot of work, right? But are you willing to take on this hard, complicated thing that needs to be solved for the business and you're willing to do it? That actually gives you a lot of scope and understanding and really wisdom about what the business needs. And so I think that's another path you can take, but you have to be willing to like really get in there and do things that maybe other people don't necessarily want to do.
To maybe sort of close out the thought about how you can grow over time, do you have a perspective on, and it may be a mix, whether or not those other sorts of opportunities to take on a really hard problem are things that in your career you sought out, or are things that maybe were brought to you by a mentor or another executive in the business?
Most of the things I didn't seek out, but I don't think anyone was bringing them to me like, "We think this would be good for your growth, Janessa." It was more
Yeah.
like, help, we need help with this. Will you help us? Which is fine. And that's the way like life works a lot of times. And so that's a really good question, Tyler. I don't think, and maybe this speaks to my poor career planning. I don't think there's a lot of things that I have been like, I want to be in charge of compensation. That
Right.
sounds great. But it's more like, okay, this is a thing we need to understand and figure out, and so let's do that. And let me be part of that solution. But there's actually no reason though, if you were like, if you recognize, I think I actually have strength and insight in this area. Let me volunteer to say, hey, I could pitch in and help. How could that happen? I think that's a perfectly legitimate way to go forward also.
I've got a few fun sort of
Okay.
fire round of questions for you. The first is looking back, you talked a little bit about your time before and after law school, but if you had one piece of advice that you'd give to young attorneys or that you might even tell your younger self to do a little differently, what would that be?
Yeah, this kind of relates actually to what we were just talking about
Mhm.
growth. And I think that is whatever the task ahead of you is, even if you don't really want to do it or it wouldn't be your first choice of things to do, just try to be awesome at it. Like just
Yeah.
try to just own it and do the best that you can do. And because that is one thing that has served me well is just even if something seems like this is not the sexy thing to be assigned to, but I'm going to just dig in and like try to really crush this and be as good as I can. One of the things that happened to me at the CFPB is there was this the way the case processes would work at that time is we'd write a little memo about the potential investigation we might start, and
Hmm.
then it would go up the chain, and they'd decide whether or not to open it, and my boss at the time asked me to do a little memo, and it was on a RESPA investigation, the Real Estate Settlement Procedures Act, which is not a law I had any interest in working on. So I wrote up my little memo, and at the end I put, "I do not wanna work on this." And and then he assigned me to the case, and I had one of those moments of being like, "Okay, you know what? I'm gonna crush this case, and I'm gonna make it the best do the best I can with it." And I really learned so much from that investigation and from that case and this process of just digging into sort of this esoteric area of the law that I wasn't that interested in, but I learned
Uh-huh.
so much from it. And I think trying to like, follow that path of, like, this is what's in front of me and I'm gonna do really well is valuable rather than being like, "Oh, I wish I was over there doing this other thing." So,
That's an amazing story. I could see someone in law school or in college writing, "I do not wanna do this on the paper," to just see if their professor is actually reading it, but
yeah.
that's funny.
Oh, he maybe did I hadn't thought of that. Maybe he didn't even read it. I don't know.
Especially given your seat now as COO too, I'm curious how you see the role of the GC evolving over time and where you think it's headed.
Well, I know what I wanna see, so I might
Yeah.
be just seeing that because it's what but I think lawyers bring or at least have the potential to bring such value to the business because I really do think lawyers are trained to think in a very systematic but also creative way about how to solve problems and really that's what businesses need. But one thing I've experienced in working in-house and especially in the startup world is people often don't know how to use a lawyer. They kind of think,
Mm.
"Oh, you're a lawyer. You're this thing that I go to when I have like a hard legal question with confusing words." But I hope to see the GC function and the legal function really evolve to be more really part of the business and contributing to the overall growth of the business, not this sort of isolated,
Mhm.
ivory tower kind of function.
Early in my career, when I was sort of beginning to work with outside counsel for the first time, I had another lawyer who was outside counsel give me some very good advice along those lines that was lawyers are not vending machines. In other words, you don't go to them
Yeah,
and put some money in and get a snack out, right? Like even with
yeah,
outside counsel, you need to really have a relationship with them. They need to
absolutely.
understand your risk tolerance, your product, where the business is
Mhm.
headed, what the strategy is. I always thought that was a nice way to sum it up, which is, and it's true for in-house lawyers as well, or in-house legal professionals too. Lawyers and legal professionals are not vending machines.
not vending machines, and there's real value too that can be added when you take the time, I think, to invest in those relationships. So, I agree.
We've heard about a great podcast. I'm curious about a book, maybe, to help folks' summer reading list that has inspired you, either personally or professionally, or if not inspired you, at least entertained.
Yeah. Well, I love reading, so there's so many books. The one that just pops into my head right now anyways is a book that I think has, and this is a business book, so I don't know if people wanna read it on the beach necessarily. It's probably not in that category, but and it's a Jim Collins book who I really love his writing, and then also, I think he's a very inspiring person as well, but he wrote this book called Good to Great. Have you read this book
I have
before?
not, no, but
Okay,
I've
okay.
I've seen it on a lot of bookshelves, so maybe I
Yeah.
should.
Yeah, it's been around for a while, so but it's the premise of the book is there's 28 companies that and he is comparing basically in sets of 2. So he's comparing a company that has sustained what he and his researchers defined as like elite growth for at least I think it was 15 years it's like a sustained period of time. They've like just had outstanding results. And then I'll have a comparator company that also had a lot of potential, but really succumbed to mediocrity as idea. And so what were the differences? Like good, this other, the second company is still good, but it wasn't great. And what makes a company
Mhm.
really great? And at least in my professional life, I love maybe to my own detriment, but I always love the idea of like, how can we take things up a notch?
Yeah.
And I think he has some really valuable insights in, what that can look like. So that would be a book that I've really enjoyed.
I'm gonna go out and, well, I might order it on Amazon or buy it from a local bookstore. That's a great
Yeah.
recommendation.
Yeah.
Um,
It's a good one.
to close us out, we've talked a little bit about this. We've talked also quite a bit about, tackling hard problems and doing hard things and the challenges associated with building a business. What has kept you motivated all throughout your career?
Yeah. That's a good question, Tyler. And sometimes I'm like, what is keeping me motivated? Well, one is that I do care a lot about the consumer financial space. It's something that's just personal to me. You know, in my family, we didn't grow up with a ton of resources, and I saw my parents be very responsible and thoughtful in the way they managed their money, and it's really motivated me to want to better understand that. So that has always been a thread for me that has kept me motivated. But, that's I think even beyond that is I like I said, for better or for worse, I am motivated by wanting to do great work
Mhm,
and that really does drive me. I don't believe that work is everything. Of course I know there's more to life than
mhm.
just that, but I really find great pleasure and joy in doing excellent work and building great teams and enjoying the people that you work with. That's one thing I feel super lucky about at Tally is I love working with the team also, in addition to really loving the work we get to do.
Well, Janessa, this has been fantastic. Thank you so much for
Yeah.
sharing really candid insights with us today on your time working in government at big companies like PayPal, now at Tally, which will is already a pretty big company, one day maybe even bigger, just like PayPal.
Yeah,
And
definitely. I'm putting it out there, Tyler.
as COO too.
Oh,
You're the first COO we've had on. I hope to have others as well who've made this
yeah.
transition. This has been really fantastic. And listeners, thanks so much for listening. And we hope to see you next time on The Abstract.
Thanks for having me.